Well, hold up. I got to see about why they're promoting racial tension at BYU. I'll be back in a second.
All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we're going to talk about a BYU professor who has taken it upon himself to slander myself and Cwic Media online in front of an audience of roughly 40,000 people. This was an obvious deceit in regards to a voicemail that was left on his phone that was not from me. However, the professor decided to insert this credulity to his followers to smear me intentionally, knowing that this really was not me on the voicemail. Now, this all has to do with a story that we went over in an episode a few weeks back. It was the manifest, how critical race theory manifests at BYU. It was in regards to a whiteness activity assignment that was put out by a social sciences professor at BYU that asked the students to go out around campus, kind of like the Red Guard or the Nazi youth, and start finding different manifestations of whiteness on campus at BYU. Wouldn't this be great if all of the professors had made this assignment and everybody could go out onto campus and start looking over everybody's shoulder to make sure that they're not working with anything that might be deemed as a whiteness type of behavior? Now, what's interesting is when this activity was made public, it was put out online in several different areas. Eventually, it got to a student group called the BYU Conservatives. They put a picture of the assignment on their Instagram account. Now, this professor was not real happy about this and made some threats to the students that they were going to be turned into the honor code for violation of certain provisions within, I guess, the honor code at Brigham Young University. I've looked at that honor code. I don't know if that really falls within what they're talking about there. I doubt that something comes of it. But there were threats that were made there, obviously, from this professor who was trying to intimidate the students to remove the picture of the survey, of the assignment. Now, what's interesting is that I had the name of the professor at the time who was the lead in making these threats to the students. And in our episode, I had a dialogue between the professor and the students, but I did not publish it. And in fact, I did not even say his name. I didn't see the point. And you guys know that follow this podcast how really over the top, probably too far, I admit, I am of separating the individuals that are responsible for some of these principles in CRT and critical social justice that I talk about, separating them from the principle itself, because I like to go and educate you on what's happening, what I see is happening. However, in this instance, and in others, I suppose, the rules have changed quite a bit here because of what he's done. And you'll see here that it is very much a malicious and slanderous, completely false attempt to try and throw me into the bus. So the new development on this is that a conservative organization called Campus Reform contacted the students of the BYU Conservatives Instagram page and asked them information about a story. Well, they put up a story about this whiteness activity at Brigham Young University. They also published the name of, this is Eric Ruiz Bybee, an education professor at BYU, as the professor who was making these threats. And again, I have zero problem now in bringing out his name and talking about this because he's brought this whole thing to a very, very public place. And because Campus Reform has brought this to a very, very public place. So what Professor Bybee did is he went on maybe a week or two ago onto Twitter and made this very long and detailed thread, which is great. Whole bunch of information in there on Twitter talking about what his point of view was on this story. Here's how he opens this up. He says, so last Thursday, a right-wing website published, it's always right-wing, a right-wing website published a story about me and another BYU colleague. This would be the professor who assigned the Whiteness activity. Since then, I have received many harassing emails / voicemails. I have decided to make public those emails, voicemails in this thread. This is important to see how he is setting the stage, because he tries to tie me in to what he deems as harassing emails. And there are some pretty vile and ridiculous emails and voicemails in there. There's no question. I would imagine that most of those come from not from BYU and not from members of the church, although some of them probably do, but probably from campus reform. Professor Bybee was put on a professor watch list. And that's probably pretty uncomfortable and does set you up as somewhat of a target, which is one of the reasons I don't usually like to put names out there. But he says, since then, I have received many harassing emails and voicemails. Mine's going to apparently be one of them, even though it's not mine. And you'll see how he's going to close this out, this long thread, when I'm done. And I'll play the voicemail for you. Now, as I go through some of this thread here, I'm only going to hit on a few of these posts. But it's interesting because it brought my attention to his Twitter page and all the things that he has tweeted. And there is an absolute treasure trove of critical race theory statements that need to be brought up and that are perfect to kind of go over so we get a better idea of what is happening at BYU, what the atmosphere is like. And just another example of critical race theory being embedded and supported with the students at Brigham Young University. So he follows up in his second tweet here. And by the way, if I go back and we take a look at this, you can see how popular this is. You'll see the voicemail that I go over with mine has about 40,000 views or listens, right? 40,000. And you can see as he's published this, he's got almost 17,000 likes on it and 5,652 retweets as of, I think this was yesterday. So very, very public portrayal that he has here of the events that ensued. In his second tweet on this, he confirms again what he's doing. He says, I am publicly sharing them because this type of harassment is a growing problem at universities, including BYU, and I want people to see how ugly it is. Something just to keep in mind here as we go through some of his tweets is that what he calls harassment is obviously a very large spectrum. Because if something's brought to light, like I do with BYU, he's calling that harassment. You'll see that. He calls it harassment. All I'm doing is taking public information that's put out there to the world and making it transparent. But he'll tie me in to those that are harassing him. So he goes through this long 50-something tweet thread where he includes a lot of these messages, these voicemails and emails that are left from him because of this campus reform and professor watch list story and development. And there are some really vile things out there. I mean, the people that do this type of thing are absolutely ridiculous. They're kind of strong-arming their position. Instead of debating and talking about the issues, they're going to be vile. And they are vile. And I feel bad that he had to go through this and that these were sent to him. What I don't feel bad about is that he included me in this. Because look, anybody that lowers themselves to that level of, I mean, it's not that you couldn't write a letter or send an email that was saying, hey, why discussing this in a civil manner and debating the issue. But when you move to a position of being vile with an individual, all it does is add ammunition to the other side of the issue. That's all it does. You're hurting the cause of fighting these pernicious ideologies. So then after he goes through all of these examples and makes them public on this Twitter thread, he then sneaks me in at the end. And look how he does this. It's a very backhanded way, very deceitful way of trying to throw me under the bus here. And look, I get this all the time, right? I probably delete, especially if I'm talking about social issues, I probably delete between 10 and 20 comments at least every single episode that I do. They come from the left and they come from the right, and both hammer me constantly. But I don't see somebody like this usually trying to put out in a very public manner, trying to be this deceitful. They'll argue with me. They'll throw names at me and accuse me of racism or whatever else they're going to do, right? But this is a whole new league here, a whole new league for this guy. He says, I'm not positive. He says, I'm not positive. Notice how he's writing this. But this sounds like a right wing, yes, because 50% of my vile comments on my episodes are from the right. This sounds like a right wing YouTuber who has been harassing my BYU colleagues for quite some time. Now, he holds my name off and holds Cwic Media off. But anybody involved with the culture wars in the church and with BYU especially are going to know exactly who he means. And of course, those that have retweeted this and those that have posted on social media about this, they simply perpetuate a lie as if this voicemail was me. He knew exactly what he was doing. Again, I'm not positive, but this sounds like a right-wing YouTuber who has been harassing my BYU colleagues for quite some time. And then he adds this, which was part of the voicemail. It says, I don't appreciate the reference to contacting my bishop. So this is very, I don't even hardly know what to say. But being that this is something, again, I get this all the time, but being that this is done in this way, so deceitful, trying to throw out a lie out there, he knows this isn't me. He knows this isn't me, right? The guy on the voicemail has a deep voice, and apparently I am the only deep-voiced English speaker in the world. So this is an absolute attempt by him to slander me because he doesn't like the things that I bring up about other professors at BYU, who I've never slandered. My only intent is to bring transparency to what is being taught at BYU. I don't agree with the issues that he agrees with. So here's the voicemail. Take a listen.
Yeah, I gotta go. No, it's over here. Well, hold up. I gotta see about why they're promoting racial tension at BYU. I'll be back in a second. Okay. Hello. Let's see here. Find out who the bishop is and...
Okay, so that's it, right? That's it. Some guy with a deep voice that really doesn't sound very much like me, I don't think, is apparently the harassing YouTuber that has bothered some of his friends. Let me tell you, I can't tell you how much of this kind of stuff I get. I feel bad that he was harassed, but I don't feel bad that you were threatening the students with what you were doing. I find it very hard to believe that you would be doing the same thing if the assignment came from the other side, from a more conservative side, and you didn't like what it said. So this guy leaves a voicemail. I'm not going to use a pejorative here, but this guy leaves a voicemail and pretends that he's on the phone or talking to somebody else while the phone is running. And this is supposed to be me. He says, I don't appreciate the reference to contacting my bishop on here. I will tell you, I do not appreciate the slander. That's exactly what the definition of slander is. It is falsehood and it is malicious intent. And that's exactly what this is. Now, within a day of him posting this thread, I responded to the thread, to this exact tweet, and said, it's not me. And something to the effect that I've already said on this episode, hey, I guess I'm the only guy with a deep voice in the world. And it's still up there. He still hasn't taken it down. He hasn't taken this off. It's been perpetuated by others, saying and treating it as if it's truth, because that's exactly what he wanted to do. And then he says, hey, I've got other things I've got to do. I've got to go to work. At the end of this tweet here, he says, as he's wrapping up this thread, after he's thrown me into the bus, he says, be kind to each other, folks. Unless, of course, you are someone who disagrees with me. I'm happy to throw you under the bus. I'm happy to be deceitful in doing it. Since we're here, and since I was on his Twitter feed, I want to go over a few things because, again, we can shed some light, just like we do on other topics or other current events, on CRT and see what people are thinking and what they post in their own words. So let's take a look at a few of those. Part of what Professor Bybee does here is my biggest concern of all, which is the conflation of the words of the prophets with secularism and ideologies like critical race theory and critical social justice that come from secularism. And academia tries in the church, several at BYU, try to bring these things together. And you've heard this before on some of the episodes that I've done. But they try to take the idea of President Oaks's root out racism and talking about white supremacist attitudes and different things like that, and conflate it with this is what we're doing. This is what CRT is. No, it's not what it is. And it's a horrific medium to try and accomplish the goals of the prophets. But to them, it's one and the same thing, and that's what they're teaching the students. You saw one professor that I had on an episode that basically brought President Nelson and Ibram Kendi together, saying it's the same thing. They're saying the same thing. That is horrible. And that is happening over and over and over again from the contacts, the letters and emails and communications that I receive. This is what he says in this. This is part of the thread. He says, but being a BYU professor means that I also help students put concepts into conversations with their faith. Now that sounds innocent enough. That's what BYU should be doing. But here's what he does. He says, I invite them to consider the significance of whiteness. God, they love this term. The significance of whiteness in LDS scriptures. And the LDS leader calls to root out racism, nationalism, and resist white supremacy. Hey, we all want to resist white supremacy. Again, I invite them to consider the significance of whiteness in LDS scriptures. This is coming, folks. This is going to come in a very, very strong way as these students are indoctrinated into these filters of how to see the world. They're going to be indoctrinated into the filters of how to see the gospel, of how to see the scriptures. It's going to be done through intersectionality. It's going to be done through critical social justice, oppressor, oppressed, conflict theory, fight against liberal democracy and capitalism. Those will all be interjected, and like our culture is becoming, they will become the prima facie primary topics for the scriptures and how to read them. And so much of that is just going to be about justice, a certain type of justice, a temporal justice. He follows this up with, in the best moments, my pedagogy, always look for that term. It's used more broadly, but it's used in academia today as critical pedagogy. Right? It's about how I'm teaching through a critical lens, capital C. That's his background. In the best moments, my pedagogy seamlessly integrates these perspectives. And some of these are taken from a little while ago, maybe up to a year ago. I kind of went through quite a bit of what he had up. It says the anti-CRT crowd defines equity differently. This is important to see. They do. Because CRT defines it. He's saying CRT defines it like this. The anti-CRT crowd defines it differently. Well, what he's talking about is end results. He's not as concerned about equality of opportunity. He cares about equality of results. That's what CRT does. It works from the back end It doesn't care much about why things are disparate at the end, why there are variables, unless they can assign oppression to it. And that's usually the answer. Not choice, not agency, not individuals, but systemic issues and oppression. Not that that doesn't ever happen. Sometimes it does, but this is an important distinction. When you focus solely on equity on the back end, you basically are following an argument that was made in the war in heaven. He goes on and says, they see it as a menacing form, CRT and stealth Marxism, which is true, that takes things from white kids and gives them to brown kids. That is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. It's about opportunity. Create a greater opportunity for those that struggle. That's what we do. Because again, he's talking mostly about education, right? K-12 education, primarily. As if those that are fighting CRT, these parents that see what is being taught at their schools, especially with COVID and Zoom becoming much more popular, and there all of a sudden there was this window created for the parents, and they could see in and see what was actually being taught to their kids, as if the parents there are concerned that something is going to be taken away from their white children and given to someone of a different color. That is disgusting. I'm sorry for getting a little emotional on that. It's disgusting. The number of those of parents that actually think that is a tiny sliver. But he is putting parents into that, all parents into that same category. He gives a reference in that tweet too. He says, here's what one parent said about equity at our last school board meeting. I saw that portion of the equity, of what he was saying there. I think it's exactly right. I fully support what was on there. I didn't listen to the whole board meeting. It was like an hour and a half long. But this specific parent, he timed it to the YouTube specific time on the video to what the parent was saying. It's exactly true. It's exactly true. And I support it 100%. If you go to the thread and if you go to his thread and you find that YouTube reference with the woman that is talking about this, one of the parents, she's a concerned parent. But CRT doesn't care about the parents. CRT cares about the agenda that is being driven in education.
I have also seen the district has a new department centered around race, equity, and inclusion, and I honor and support diversity, inclusion, and equality. Equity is the word that raises concern for me.
Good job.
This sounds a lot like critical race theory. We do have plenty of examples in history where equity has not resulted in better outcomes. I've asked clarifying questions to the district with no response. With equity, are you going to take opportunities away from some to give to another? What are those opportunities? Who is deciding the end goal? What is equitable? CRT promotes unfair and unearned success while punishing the values of hard work, honesty, respect, and civility.
This is all true in their own words.
Equity doesn't raise everybody up, but it will result in bringing everybody down. We should never divide people into identity groups of oppressed versus oppressor. This turns people against one another. The us versus them mentality leaves no neutral ground for finding unity.
Okay, she's exactly right. So great reference, Professor, on putting this up, because she is saying the right thing. There's when she says critical race theory is just a theory, that is not true. It is full of praxis and activism. And it's kind of like saying Marxism is just an economic theory. It doesn't work that way. That's not how it works in the real world. Here's another thing about this is something I had originally before also that I held back on, but this is one of the communications he has here to the BYU conservatives. He says this activity, the whiteness activity, is a response to the prophetic call to root out racism, nationalism, and prejudice of any kind in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So we're going to send out the Red Guard students to throughout the campus here to root out racism. This is the call from the prophet, according to this professor. This is very It's radicalizing the kids. This is radicalizing the kids. He goes through and supports, well, I'm not going to get into this right now. I can do this another time. But this is radicalizing the kids, and he has no problem with it. He has, in fact, edited a book about radical politics. All right, moving on to another one. He says, let's be clear about something. The anti-CRT movement, see how he's very invested. I mean, he's an education professor. He's very invested in those that are concerned about what is being brought in to K-12, right? He wants the CRT in K-12. You can see this throughout his Twitter, his tweets. He wants CRT in there. He says the anti-CRT movement is not just about eliminating accurate discussions of race in schools. Most people aren't going to have an issue with that, right? There are some states and some school boards where parents do go a little overboard, I will say. They go a little overboard and they don't want anything brought up or very little brought up about slavery or other things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's what he's saying. This is an issue that, if you look at the 1619 Project, for example, with Nicole Hannah-Jones, that is an issue of changing history, of moving the founding of America away from liberal democracy and capitalism and American ideals that we believe are inspired, right? And moving them to something else where it's to show that the founding of America is built on slavery. So it depends on what he's saying here. These extremists are also opposed to equity. Yes, equity is a bad, horrific ideal. Horrific. And policies that support it in schools. Again, equity ends up, the only way you get equity is force and tyranny. We have found this out over and over and over again in the 20th century. It is suffering, it is tyranny, and if it's put onto a large, broad basis throughout government and throughout nations, it's death, it's imprisonment, it's the breakup of families. Equity is a very bad goal as compared to equality of opportunity, as President Oaks specifically says. Here's a retweet he has of Mike Lee. It doesn't look like he likes Mike Lee a whole lot here in his politics. He's got a hashtag here that's hashtag humans against Mike Lee. Okay. Here's what Mike Lee had put out there. It says, we have seen in recent years what happens when we indulge the cultural fragmentation. It's a very good phrase. The cultural fragmentation of our national community. Critical race theory does not celebrate diversity. It weaponizes diversity. That is a very true statement. I don't care where that would have come from the left or from the right, from the Democrats, from the Republicans. That is a very true statement. And by the way, I know a lot of Democrats that agree 100% with that statement. And Professor Bybee here says, nope. Right? So again, he believes that according to him here, he believes that critical race theory is not weaponizing diversity, while he supports a colleague with a whiteness activity to go out and send students to find events, behavior of whiteness out on the campus of Brigham Young University. And here's another one. He's very big on fighting off this anti-CRT agenda. You see, he's very supportive of a CRT agenda in K-12 schools. Now, I don't know how much he teaches that in his classes, where he is, I'm guessing, I don't know. I mean, if he's professor of education, is he teaching those that are going into education? Well, I think so, right? He says the anti-CRT agenda of eliminating discussions of race in schools is alarming. Okay, what does that mean, discussions of race? Where we amplify the discussions, where we make greater and greater divisions because we take so much time to focus on it, or to make sure that we talk about slavery and that we talk about injustices that have happened in the past in the country. but we don't dwell on them. Because in most schools, K to 12, not all, but most schools talk about those things. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about them. I don't know enough about how much of that is talked about, but I know there is a base there. And there has been for decades. I was taught all of these things. I was taught about the disparity of African Americans in the early and mid 20th century. I was taught about Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Act. And that's back in the 70s and 80s. I think a lot of what those that are wanting to deride the anti-CRT agenda and the parents who are worried about this, what they really want to add in there when they talk about adding more talks about race is they want to add in there the radicals. They want more references to an Angela Davis, right? The Marxist. They want more from Kimberly Crenshaw. On the feminist side, they want more from Judith Butler. They want more from those that are hard left icons and use them as references. How do I know that? Because I've seen the curriculum. I've seen what's been recommended by state school boards. You should go look at California's. Every single reference is from a book or a speech from a radical leftist from several different minorities that help form the curriculum for California, and that's K to 12. I've seen it. I've read it. And they refer to it as critical race theory. So what do you mean by more discussions of race in school? It all depends on what you're talking about. Now, another thing that the professor goes over here often is, well, that he retweets often is the handle Ida Bay Wells. That this is Nicole Hannah-Jones. She is the founder of the 1619 Project, right? The 1619 Project that, in its own words, which has been removed now from the New York Times website, they're the ones supporting this, in their own words, want to move the founding of America from 1776 to 1619. And this is the perfect little capsule of understanding the historical part, the history part of critical race theory, right? History is a very small part of what critical race theory is. But to understand critical race theory is to understand the 1619 Project. It wants to pull away from liberal democracy, the Scottish Enlightenment, Jeffersonian style government. And that includes the Constitution. I don't know where this professor stands on that, but critical race theorists, crits, right? The movers and shakers, the big pundits, the authors, they definitely disagree with the Constitution. They disagree with an assimilation to a common constitutional law. That's their own words. So if they can pull away from those things and move it to 1619, when the slaves first came through the transatlantic slave trade to America, then see, they can show that America is founded on slavery. And we can pull away from these American ideals that they dislike so much. The tweet itself, though, is pretty interesting that Nicole Hannah-Jones puts out. She says, the anti-CRT propaganda, as if CRT isn't propaganda, is now being called out for what it is. So they're changing tactics to maintain a veneer of legitimacy by pretending all they want now is transparency. That's not all I want. That's a very important part of it. I want transparency. That's a lot of what I do. She says, you know what involved parents do if they want to know the curriculum? Ask the teacher. Well, that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do when you see this coming in from all angles into your fifth graders, your second graders, your high school students' classes, you can go to the board and you can say, I don't like this. That is not being a domestic terrorist. That's being a parent, an involved parent. Here's another one, and this becomes very interesting because we're going to get to a tweet here in a minute where you're going to see the Mott and Bailey strategy of let me put this out there for some people, let me pull back for others. He's being very bold here. about what his beliefs are in supporting CRT, but you're going to see where he supports something that is almost the antithesis of what he's saying so far, but goes right along the lines of, well, it is just fighting the anti-CRT movement. I'll get to that in just a second here, but here's this tweet here. Here's what this says. Let's bring this up a little bit more. He says, far-right conservatives have actually formed a political action committee to fund anti-CRT activists to run for local school boards. That's okay, right? I mean, that's called democracy on either side. I mean, CRT activists can also have political action committees to run for school boards. Let's let the parents decide. They're the voters, and they'll decide who goes on their boards. He says they are planning on running on this issue in 2022 midterm elections. They should. It's a huge issue. We need to take them seriously. Yeah, because you want critical race theory in schools. And then you can see where he goes on into not just CRT, but actually intersectionality, which again is just, I mean, the easiest way to explain that is taking CRT and expanding it out to other marginalized groups. He says it's more than just CRT. These policies, these are school K-12 policies, seek to stifle teaching about whole ranges of issues related to race, American history, politics, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Right? So, if you're a parent, you should have the decision here as to whether these are things you want your kids to learn about in school or in the home. Do you focus on sexual orientation and gender identity in school? Well, look, we live in a democracy. You make your own choices. You choose and vote for who you want on your school board. If you're a parent and you're concerned about things one way or the other, either side, you go out and you vote and you speak up. What I don't like is that he's not asking about the parents enough. What about the parents? What do they want for their kids? Apparently, in a lot of these discussions, and it's not just him, there is a complete divide to them, to those that are pushing CRT and K-12. You can see how much he is. Between the parents and the kids. The parents become domestic terrorists and are ridiculous for voicing a concern about CRT. Again, there's some hyperbole there. There are some things where the parents just don't understand what they're saying, but they know there's a concern there. There's something there to them. They just can't quite put their finger on it. But they are the parent. Let them decide. Not university professors, not politicians, the parents. The parents decide ultimately what will be taught. And here's the tweet I was talking about. That where he goes pretty much the opposite end, 180 degrees. Because this is the Mott and Bailey, right? I'm pushing this out there and then I'm pulling it back in. This is what he retweets this from Joshua Holland here that says, it drives me crazy that normal people think there's an actual debate over critical race theory and try to engage in it. In other words, stay out of this, right? As if there's any debate. Critical race theory is real, it's true, and it has to be in place, right? That's what the professor here is supporting by retweeting this. The tweet goes on and says, CRT is a good thing for grad students to learn. It's a different environment. Nobody's teaching it to kids. And it isn't an issue of public interest. This is a fascist propaganda campaign, as he's just gone over and over and over talking about how he's supporting CRT and is against the anti-CRT agenda. You see how that works, and you see this all the time. If there's no CRT being taught in schools, why does he care about the anti-CRT agenda? This is 180 degrees from everything else that he's tweeting. And again, as I've said in several episodes, I promise you, and I have read thousands and thousands of pages of state curriculum. CRT is everywhere, and it's coming in stronger and stronger and stronger into the K-12 environment. So anyway, his Twitter feed was again a treasure trove of gems to kind of go over and talk a little bit more about CRT and to understand the push that there is on getting CRT into the K-12 schools. You saw that last tweet. Don't pay any attention to that. It's just not true. It is everywhere. So anyway, what started out here as a slander and a malicious and false accusation that was used to gin up support and likes and perpetuate a false and narrative about myself and Cwic Media turned into a pretty good teaching moment in going through what this professor is talking about and the different issues about CRT going into education. This will be a fight, and it's got to be fought by people standing up. You can't sit back on this. The whole push about whiteness and about segregation and about forced equity in the back end and the rising up of teaching of radical icons is very much a big part of the push of CRT into the K-12 space. Thanks for listening.